A betrayed elderly couple entered a decaying forest home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. What they found hidden in the basement would expose the biggest financial secret in 3 counties and change their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning Harold and Margaret Murphy lost everything started like any other Tuesday. The October sun crept through the lace curtains of their farmhouse kitchen, casting pale gold patterns across the worn linoleum floor. Margaret stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal the way she had for 43 years, while Harold sat at the table reading yesterday's newspaper because they'd cancelled their subscription months ago to save money. Neither of them knew that in less than 2 hours, a man in a cheap suit would knock on their door and shatter the life they'd spent half a century building. Harold was 72 years old, with hands like leather gloves and a back that had carried the weight of 1,000 freight loads. He'd started Murphy Trucking in 1981 with a single rusted International harvester and a dream too stubborn to die. Back then, he and Margaret lived in a one-room apartment above a hardware store, eating canned soup and counting pennies like prayers. Margaret was 69, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with eyes that still sparkled when she laughed. She'd done the books for Murphy Trucking since the very first invoice, handwriting each receipt in neat cursive, balancing ledgers by candlelight during power outages, stretching every dollar until it begged for mercy. Together, they'd built something from nothing. 12 trucks at their peak, 23 employees who felt like family, a reputation in 3 counties for honest work and fair prices. And this house, this creaking, drafty, beautiful house on Miller Road, where they'd raised memories instead of children, since God had other plans for them on that front. But they had Derek. Derek came to them when he was 11 years old, skinny and scared, with a garbage bag full of clothes and eyes that had seen too much too young. His mother, Harold's sister, had died in a car accident on Route 17. His father had never been in the picture. Social services called Harold on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, Derek was sitting at this very kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate and refusing to cry. They raised him like their own, paid for his braces, his baseball uniforms, his college tuition at Ohio State. When he graduated with a business degree, Harold brought him into Murphy Trucking with open arms and a corner office. When Derek got married, they paid for the wedding. When Derek got divorced, they let him move back into the guest room for 8 months without charging a dime. And when Harold had his stroke 2 years ago, a minor one, the doctors said, just a warning shot across the bow, it was Derek who sat beside his hospital bed and said the words that would eventually destroy them. "Uncle Harold, you need to take it easy. Let me handle the business stuff. I'll take care of everything." Power of attorney. 3 words that felt like love at the time. Harold signed the papers without reading them twice because Derek was family, and family didn't betray family. That's what Harold believed with every fiber of his being, right up until the moment he stopped believing it. The knock came at 9:47 in the morning. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door, expecting maybe the mailman or one of the neighbors. Instead, she found a thin man in a wrinkled brown suit, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Murphy?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm here to serve you with official notice." He thrust an envelope into her hands before she could respond. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." "I'm sorry, ma'am." Margaret stared at the envelope like it might bite her. "Vacate? This is our home. We've lived here for 38 years. The man was already backing down the porch steps. "You'll need to take that up with the new owners, ma'am. I'm just the messenger." "New owners?" Margaret's voice cracked. "There must be some mistake. We own this house. We paid it off in 2003. But the man was gone, his sedan kicking up gravel as it disappeared down the long driveway. Margaret stood frozen on the porch, the autumn wind cutting through her thin cardigan, the envelope trembling in her hands, Harold found her there 3 minutes later, still staring at nothing. "Maggie, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She handed him the envelope without a word. What followed was the worst 48 hours of their lives. Phone calls that went to voicemail, bank accounts that showed zero balances, a lawyer who charged them $300 just to tell them they'd been robbed by their own nephew. Derek had done it slowly, methodically, over 23 months. First, he'd transferred the trucking company into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Then he'd taken out loans against the business using Harold's forged signature. Then he'd sold the trucks one by one to a buyer in Kentucky who paid cash and asked no questions. The house had been the final piece. A quit-claim deed, backdated and notarized by someone Derek knew, transferred the property to yet another shell company. By the time Harold and Margaret understood what had happened, Derek was already in Florida, unreachable, living in a condo purchased with their life savings. $473,000, the lawyer said, sliding a summary across his desk. That's what we can document so far, possibly more. Harold sat in that leather chair, 72 years old, and felt something inside him crack like old timber. Not his heart, that would have been easier. This was something deeper. His faith, his trust, the bedrock belief that if you worked hard and loved honestly, the world would treat you fair. Margaret held his hand and didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears didn't fix anything. "What can we do?" she asked quietly. The lawyer sighed. "You can file a police report. You can sue. But I'll be honest with you. Cases like this take years. And Derek, he's covered his tracks. The money's probably already offshore or converted to assets we can't trace. As for the house," he paused. "The documents look legitimate. Even if they're forged, proving that in court could take 18 months, maybe longer, and you'd need to pay legal fees up front." "We don't have any money," Harold said, his voice flat. "He took it all." The lawyer nodded slowly, the way people do when they're about to say something useless. "I'm sorry, I truly am. But legally speaking, you need to vacate the property within 30 days, or you'll be forcibly removed." They drove home in silence. The truck, a borrowed 1994 Ford F-150 from their neighbor Cal, rattled and groaned over every pothole. Harold stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. Margaret watched the familiar roads pass by like a funeral procession. The diner where they'd had their first date in 1974, the church where they'd gotten married, the elementary school that had been torn down and rebuilt twice since they'd moved here. 43 years, 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice and small joys, and now they had nothing, less than nothing. They had debt and shame, and a nephew who had looked them in the eyes every Sunday dinner and lied with a smile. When they pulled into the driveway, Margaret finally spoke. "Where will we go?" Harold didn't answer right away. He killed the engine and sat there, listening to it tick as it cooled. The house loomed before them. White clabbered siding, black shutters, a wraparound porch they'd added in 1988. Every nail, every board, every coat of paint held a memory. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe Cal will let us stay in his guest room for a while, just until we figure something out." Margaret shook her head slowly. "We can't impose on people, Harold. Not like this, not at our age." They sat in the truck for a long time, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, painting the clouds orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A flock of geese passed overhead, heading south for the winter. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. "Do you remember Aunt Eleanor?" Harold frowned. "Your mother's aunt? The one who lived out in the mountains?" "The one everyone said was crazy." Margaret's voice was distant, like she was reaching back through decades. "She died when I was 19, left me something in her will." "Left you what?" "A house, out past Wheeling, deep in the Appalachian forest. I never went to see it. Everyone said it was worthless, a crumbling wreck in the middle of nowhere. My mother told me to forget about it, said Eleanor was touched in the head and probably left nothing but debt and heartache. Harold turned to look at her. You never mentioned this before. Because I forgot about it, Harold. It was 50 years ago. I was a teenager, and we had our own lives to build. I never thought about that house again. She paused. But it's still mine. I'm sure of it. I never sold it, never signed anything. If the deed is still in my name, then it's the only thing Derek didn't steal. They looked at each other, and for the first time in 48 hours, something other than despair passed between them. Not hope exactly, more like the ghost of hope, the memory of what it felt like to have options. We don't know what condition it's in, Harold said carefully. Could be completely collapsed, could be condemned. Margaret nodded. Could be, but it's something, it's ours. 2 weeks later, after sleeping on Cal's pull-out couch and eating his wife's casseroles and trying not to feel like charity cases, they loaded their remaining possessions into the borrowed truck and headed east. The drive took 7 hours. The roads got narrower and rougher as they climbed into the mountains, winding through small towns that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. Service stations with hand-painted signs, general stores with creaking wooden floors, churches with graveyards older than the nation. By the time they turned onto County Road 47, the sun was already starting to set. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, no signal this deep in the forest. They navigated by an old paper map Margaret had found at a gas station, tracing faded lines with her finger. Should be coming up on the left, she said. Property marker says Whitmore. That was Eleanor's maiden name. Harold slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the tree line. Everything looked the same. Dense forest, overgrown with vines and brambles, the kind of wilderness that swallowed things whole and never gave them back. Then he saw it. A rusted iron gate, nearly invisible beneath a curtain of ivy. 2 stone pillars, crumbling but still standing, with carved letters barely visible under decades of moss. Whitmore. This is it, Margaret whispered. Harold pulled over and got out. The gate wasn't locked. The chain had rusted through years ago, but it took all his strength to push it open, the hinges screaming in protest. The driveway beyond was more suggestion than road. 2 dirt tracks disappearing into the shadows beneath ancient oaks and towering pines. They drove slowly, branches scraping against the truck like skeletal fingers. The forest pressed in from all sides, thick and dark and silent. No birds sang, no insects hummed. Just the crunch of gravel beneath their tires and the pounding of their hearts. The trees opened suddenly, and there it was. The house rose from the forest floor like something out of a fever dream. 3 stories tall, Victorian in style, with a wraparound porch and a turret on the eastern corner. It had been painted white once, maybe blue, but now it was the color of old bones, grey and weathered, streaked with green where moss had taken hold. The windows were dark, some of them boarded, others reflecting the dying light like blind eyes. The roof sagged in places, and a section of the porch railing had collapsed entirely. Vines climbed the walls like veins, and the front yard, if you could call it that, had become a jungle of waist-high weeds and wild roses gone to thorns. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh, Harold!" He didn't respond, just stared at the house, taking it in, trying to reconcile this decaying monument with the possibility of shelter. "It's still standing," he finally said. "That's something." They got out of the truck and approached carefully, testing each porch step before putting their weight on it. The boards groaned but held. The front door was solid oak, warped with age but intact. Harold tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Margaret. "You have a key?" She shook her head. "I never had a key. I never came here, remember?" Harold examined the lock. It was old, ornate, the kind they hadn't made in decades, but as he looked closer, something caught his attention. The brass around the keyhole was polished, not shiny exactly, but cleaner than the rest of the door, like someone had been using it. "That's strange," he muttered. Margaret noticed it too. Maybe someone's been maintaining the property, a caretaker? "For 50 years? Without ever contacting you?" She had no answer for that. Harold stepped back and looked at the windows. Most were dark, curtained or boarded, but near the base of the house he spotted a cellar door, the kind that opened at an angle, leading down into the foundation. It was wooden, weathered like everything else, but the hinges... He walked over and crouched down, running his fingers along the metal, fresh oil, unmistakable. "Maggie," he called softly, "come look at this." She joined him, and together they stared at the cellar door. Someone had been here recently. Someone had oiled these hinges, maintained this entrance. But why? And who? Harold gripped the handle and pulled. The door swung open smoothly, silently, not the shriek of rusted metal he expected, but a whisper. Cool air rushed out, carrying the scent of stone and something else, something chemical, something preserved. Concrete steps descended into darkness. "We need a light," Margaret said. Harold returned to the truck and dug through their boxes until he found a flashlight. The batteries were old, the beam weak and yellow, but it would have to do. They descended together, each step careful and measured. The walls were stone, fitted together with precision that spoke of craftsmanship and money. The ceiling was low, forcing Harold to duck, and the air grew colder as they went deeper. At the bottom, they found a door. Steel, modern, completely out of place in this ancient cellar. And it was unlocked. Harold pushed it open, and the flashlight beam swept across a room that made no sense. Finished floors, painted walls, electrical outlets, a light switch. He flipped it, half expecting nothing to happen. The lights came on. They stood there, blinking in the sudden brightness, trying to understand what they were seeing. This wasn't a cellar, it was an apartment. A small one, but complete. A living area with a sofa and chairs, a kitchenette with a refrigerator humming softly, a bathroom visible through an open door. Everything was clean, organized, waiting. "Harold," Margaret breathed, "what is this place?" He shook his head slowly. "I have no idea." On a small table near the sofa, they found an envelope. It was addressed in faded handwriting, the ink brown with age. "To whoever finds this home." Margaret picked it up with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same careful script. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way here despite everything. The house above may look forgotten, but it remembers. It has been waiting, as I have been waiting, for someone worthy. What lies below is not for the faint of heart. It is not for the greedy or the cruel. It is for those who have been broken by the world and still choose to stand. If that is you, then go to the pantry on the main floor. Press the third shelf from the bottom on the left side. A door will open. What you find beyond it is yours now. Use it wisely. The wolves will come." Eleanor Whitmore, 1973. Margaret read it twice, then handed it to Harold. Her hands were shaking. 1973, she whispered. "She wrote this 4 years before she died. She's been waiting, this whole time." Harold looked around the underground apartment again, seeing it now with different eyes. This wasn't abandonment. This was preparation. Eleanor had built this space, maintained it somehow, left instructions that had waited half a century to be followed. "We need to go upstairs," he said quietly. "We need to find that pantry." They climbed back up through the cellar, the flashlight now unnecessary, their hearts pounding with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The main floor of the house was exactly what they'd expected from outside. Dusty, cobwebbed, filled with furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts of another era. But the structure was sound. The floors didn't sag. The walls were straight. Beneath the decay, something solid remained. They found the kitchen through a swinging door off the main hallway. It was large, designed for an era when families cooked elaborate meals and servants moved through back corridors. The stove was ancient, the sink stained with rust, but the cabinets were intact. And there, in the corner, was the pantry. Margaret approached first. The door opened with a creak, revealing shelves lined with mason jars and canned goods, preserved food that had to be decades old, maybe older. Dust covered everything in a fine grey layer. "Third shelf from the bottom," she said, counting down. "On the left side." Harold reached past her and pressed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a soft click, followed by a mechanical hum that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The entire back section of the pantry swung inward, revealing not a closet or storage space, but a staircase. These stairs were different from the cellar. They were wider, carpeted in deep red velvet that had faded to rust. Brass handrails ran along both walls, polished to a dull gleam. And electric lights, small recessed bulbs, flickered on automatically as the door opened. The stairs led down, curving gently, disappearing into a darkness that somehow felt alive. Harold and Margaret looked at each other. 50 years of marriage meant they could communicate without words. Fear passed between them, and wonder, and something else, the stubborn refusal to turn back now, no matter what lay ahead. "Together?" Harold asked. Margaret took his hand. "Always." They descended. The staircase went deeper than seemed possible, down past where the cellar apartment had been, down into the bedrock of the mountain itself. The air grew colder with each step, but it wasn't damp or stale. It was crisp, clean, almost clinical. At the bottom they found another door. This one was different again, heavier, reinforced, with a wheel lock like something from a bank vault. But it stood slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open specifically for them. Harold pulled it wide. The room beyond stole the breath from both their lungs. It was enormous, the size of a gymnasium, with ceilings that arched 20 feet overhead. The walls were lined with steel shelving, and on those shelves sat row after row of safety deposit boxes, each one numbered in brass plates. In the center of the room, arranged in neat rows like soldiers at attention, stood pallets covered in thick plastic. And visible through that plastic, catching the light from overhead fixtures, was gold. Bars of it, hundreds of them, stacked in perfect pyramids, gleaming with the warm yellow light of wealth beyond imagination. Margaret's knees buckled. Harold caught her, steadying them both against the nearest shelf. His own legs felt like water. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Harold, this can't be real." But it was. They walked forward in a daze, touching the plastic, counting the pallets. There were 37 of them, each holding what looked like at least 50 bars. Beyond the gold, they found other treasures. Vintage stock certificates in acid-free sleeves, bearer bonds that appeared to have never been cashed, rare coins in glass cases, jewelry boxes stacked 3 high, each one containing pieces that sparkled like frozen starlight. And at the far end of the vault, behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a 19th century bank, they found another letter. This one was longer, more detailed, and addressed specifically to Margaret. "To my great-niece Margaret, if you ever find your way here. I have watched you from a distance your whole life. I know you never understood me, and perhaps you thought as others did that I was mad. Perhaps I was. But there is a madness that sees clearly and a sanity that is blind. I spent my life working in the shadows. The wealthy came to me during the Cold War, terrified that the government would seize their assets in a crisis. I helped them hide what they had, protect what they'd earned, prepare for disasters that never came. They paid me well. They paid me in gold and bonds and secrets. But I never trusted banks, and I never trusted institutions. I built this vault with my own hands and my own money, brick by brick, over 31 years. I filled it with everything I was given, and I told no one. I chose you, Margaret, because of the letters you wrote me as a child. Do you remember? You were 9 years old. and you sent me a card for my birthday. You drew a picture of a house with a sun over it, and you wrote, "Dear Aunt Eleanor, I hope you are not lonely. Love, Margaret." No one else ever asked if I was lonely. I was, I always was, but knowing you were out there, kind and good, gave me something to protect. What lies in this vault is worth more than you can imagine. I estimate its current value at over $265 million, though that number will change with time. It is yours now, free and clear. I have made provisions, sealed documents with 3 separate law firms, each unaware of the others, to ensure no one can take this from you. But be warned, the wolves will come. They always do when treasure is found. Trust no one with a smooth tongue. Trust no one who asks too many questions. Trust only those who show you kindness when they think there is nothing to gain. I have also left you something in the desk drawer, a journal. It contains everything you need to know, accounts, contacts, and instructions for converting these assets safely, slowly, without drawing attention. You have been betrayed, Margaret. I know this because I arranged for a certain letter to reach you only if you lost everything else. If you are reading these words, then the world has taken from you, and you have come to the only place left. Now take from the world, but do it wisely, do it kindly. And remember, the greatest wealth is not what we hold, but what we give. With love across the years, Eleanor. Margaret held the letter to her chest and wept, not from sorrow this time, but from something she couldn't name, gratitude and grief and wonder all tangled together. Harold stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, staring at the vault that stretched before them. 24 hours ago, they had been homeless, penniless, betrayed by the one person they trusted most. Now they stood in a room worth more than most people could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. "What do we do?" Margaret asked through her tears. Harold looked at her, then at the gold, then at the letter still trembling in her hands. "We read the journal," he said softly. "We learn what Eleanor wanted us to learn." And then he paused, thinking of Derek, of the trucking company they'd built, of the home they'd lost, of all the years of honest work that had been stolen in silence. "And then we figure out how to make this right." But even as he said it, Harold felt something stir in the back of his mind. Eleanor's warning echoed like a bell tolling in the darkness. The wolves will come. They always do, and somewhere, 600 miles away in a beachfront condo in Florida, a young man named Derek Murphy stared at his laptop screen, frowning at a notification he'd just received. A property alert, set up years ago and long forgotten, triggered by unusual activity. The Whitmore Estate, Appalachian County, West Virginia. Recent access detected. Derek leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Well, well," he murmured to himself. "Looks like Aunt Maggie found her inheritance after all." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a man answered. "I need you to find out everything you can about a property in West Virginia," Derek said, "and make it fast. I think my dear aunt and uncle just stumbled onto something valuable." He hung up and looked out at the ocean, waves crashing against the shore in the fading light. He'd taken everything from them, their money, their home, their trust. He thought the game was over. But games, as Derek knew better than anyone, had a way of going into overtime, and this one was just getting started. The first night in the vault, neither Harold nor Margaret slept. They sat together on the worn leather sofa in the underground apartment, the one Eleanor had prepared decades ago, and they read. The journal was thick, bound in burgundy leather that had cracked with age, filled with page after page of Eleanor's careful handwriting. Some entries were dated, others weren't. Some were practical instructions, others read like confessions whispered into the darkness by a woman who had no one else to tell. Margaret held the journal while Harold sat close, their shoulders touching, reading by the soft glow of a lamp that had waited 50 years to be turned on. "I began this work in 1958, Eleanor had written on the first page. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still 4 years away, but those of us who paid attention could see the storm clouds gathering. The wealthy understood something the common folk did not, that governments, even our own, could become desperate, and desperate governments do desperate things. Harold rubbed his eyes and looked at Margaret. "Your aunt was involved in some serious business." Margaret nodded slowly, turning the page. "I always thought she was just eccentric. My mother said she never married, never had children, lived alone in the mountains like a hermit. But this," she gestured at the vault beyond the apartment door, "this isn't the work of a hermit." They read on. Eleanor's story unfolded across hundreds of entries spanning 3 decades. She had been brilliant. That much was clear from the first few pages. Graduated from Barnard College in 1947 with a degree in economics, one of only 12 women in her class. Worked briefly on Wall Street before the men's club atmosphere drove her away. Moved to Washington, found work as a researcher for a congressional committee studying post-war financial policy. That's where she learned how money really moved. "The truly wealthy don't keep their assets in banks," she wrote in an entry from 1959. "Banks can be seized, frozen, audited. The truly wealthy keep their assets in things: gold, art, land, bearer bonds, things that can be hidden, moved and converted without leaving a paper trail." She started small. A colleague introduced her to a family of German immigrants, industrialists who had fled Europe before the war, with most of their fortune converted to gold coins sewn into their coat linings. They wanted help establishing a secure storage system, something outside the traditional banking structure. Eleanor built them a vault beneath their summer home in the Berkshires. Word spread quietly through the shadowy networks of old money and new paranoia. More clients came, families who had survived the Russian Revolution and still flinched at the word nationalization. Latin American businessmen who watched their neighbors' assets seized by populist governments. Even some American industrialists who feared what might happen if the Cold War ever turned hot. Eleanor never advertised. She never had an office or a business card. Clients found her through whispers, through trusted intermediaries, through the kind of connections that existed only in drawing rooms and private clubs, and she was paid extraordinarily well. "They pay me in what they trust," she wrote in 1963. "Gold, mostly. Sometimes bonds or rare coins. Occasionally artwork or jewelry. Never cash, never checks, nothing that could be traced." Over the years, Eleanor accumulated more than she could ever spend. She had no expensive tastes, no lavish lifestyle. She lived simply, reinvested carefully, and watched her holdings grow. But she never forgot the lesson that had started it all. Institutions could not be trusted. Governments could not be trusted. Even banks, especially banks, could not be trusted. So she built her own vault. The entry describing its construction was dated 1962, the same year as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Eleanor had purchased the Whitmore property, her family's ancestral home, long abandoned, and begun the project in secret. She hired workers from 3 different states, none of them knowing the full scope of what they were building. She designed the ventilation system herself, based on specifications she'd obtained from a contact in the Swiss banking industry. "I have created something that will outlast me," she wrote, "something that will outlast governments and wars and all the petty schemes of men. This vault will stand for 100 years, 200, however long it takes, and someday someone worthy will find it." Margaret closed the journal and pressed her palm against the cover, feeling the texture of the old leather. "She built all this because she was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of what the world might become." Harold shook his head. "Not afraid. Prepared. There's a difference." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Eleanor's legacy pressing down on them like a physical force. $265 million, Margaret whispered. "Harold, what are we supposed to do with $265 million? He didn't have an answer. None of this felt real. 48 hours ago they had been penniless, betrayed, facing the prospect of living in a borrowed truck. Now they sat in an underground vault surrounded by more wealth than most small countries possessed. "We need to understand exactly what's here," Harold finally said. "We need to inventory everything, document it, figure out what can be converted and how." Eleanor left instructions. "We need to follow them." Margaret nodded, grateful for the practical focus. It was easier to think about tasks than to think about the enormity of what they'd inherited. They started the next morning. The vault was organized with military precision, a testament to Eleanor's methodical mind. Each section was labeled, each category documented in supplementary ledgers stored in fireproof cabinets near the entrance. The gold came first. 37 pallets, each containing 52 bars of .9999 fine gold, each bar weighing approximately 400 troy ounces. Harold did the math 3 times, convinced he was making an error. "That's over 70,000 troy ounces," he said, his voice hoarse. "At current prices, Margaret, that's over $140 million in gold alone." Margaret sat down heavily on a nearby crate, her legs suddenly unsteady. The bearer bonds were next. These were artifacts of another era, negotiable instruments that paid interest to whoever held them, no questions asked. Most had been issued by major corporations and government agencies in the 1960s and 70s, when such instruments were still legal. Many had technically matured, but the documentation suggested they could still be redeemed through certain specialty brokers who handled legacy instruments, value approximately $43 million. The rare coins filled 17 safety deposit boxes, each one containing specimens that belonged in museums. Gold double eagles from the early 1900s, proof sets never circulated, colonial currency from before the Revolution. Numismatic valuations based on Eleanor's notes placed the collection at over $28 million. The vintage stock certificates were more complicated. Some were from companies that no longer existed, worthless paper. But others represented shares in firms that had been acquired, merged, or restructured over the decades. Eleanor had tracked these changes meticulously, and her notes indicated that the shares, properly claimed through the right legal channels, were worth approximately $31 million. And then there was the jewelry, 12 cases, each one containing pieces that took Margaret's breath away. Diamond necklaces from the Gilded Age, ruby brooches that had once adorned European royalty, emerald earrings with provenances stretching back centuries. Many pieces came with documentation linking them to famous collections. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, families whose names had once commanded empires. Conservative estimate, $23 million. When they finished the inventory 3 days later, the total exceeded even Eleanor's estimate. Accounting for appreciation in gold prices and other market changes since her last recorded valuation, the vault contained assets worth approximately $271 million. Margaret sat at Eleanor's desk, surrounded by ledgers and notes, and laughed. It was a strange sound, half joy, half hysteria. "We were evicted from our home for missing a payment of $1,800, she said. "And now this." Harold stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "Life doesn't make sense, Maggie. Never has. We just have to deal with what's in front of us." She looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "What do? We can't just walk into a bank with a pallet of gold bars. We'd be arrested or robbed or both." Eleanor thought of that. Harold picked up a smaller notebook from the desk, one they hadn't fully explored yet. She left contacts, people who help with exactly this kind of situation. The notebook contained names, phone numbers, and addresses, along with detailed notes about each contact's specialty and trustworthiness. Some were precious metals dealers in Switzerland and Hong Kong. Others were estate attorneys who specialized in complex inheritance situations. A few were what Eleanor called facilitators, individuals who could convert unusual assets to conventional currency for a percentage. "We start small," Harold said. "We contact one of these attorneys, explain the situation, get proper legal documentation. Then we convert some of the gold, just enough to stabilize our situation. Pay off any remaining debts, establish ourselves properly, figure out our next moves." Margaret nodded slowly. It was a plan. It wasn't a complete plan, but it was something to hold on to. What happens next will expose the wolves Eleanor warned about, reveal a betrayal that runs deeper than blood, and prove that sometimes the ones who've lost everything are the only ones worthy of finding it all. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. While Harold and Margaret were discovering the extent of their inheritance, 600 miles away in Boca Raton, Florida, Derek Murphy was doing research of his own. He sat in his home office, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic, clicking through property records on his laptop. The Whitmore estate had triggered his alert system 3 days ago, and since then he'd been digging. What he found surprised him. The property had been in the Whitmore family since 1873, originally part of a larger land grant that had been subdivided over generations. Eleanor Whitmore had inherited it in 1941 and held it until her death in 1977. At that point, according to probate records, the property had passed to her great-niece, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, now Margaret Murphy. Derek frowned at the screen. He'd known about the inheritance vaguely, had heard Uncle Harold mention it once or twice over the years, but he'd never paid attention because everyone said it was worthless. A crumbling mansion in the middle of nowhere, more liability than asset. So why were Harold and Margaret there now? He picked up his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Vincent, it's Derek. I need a favor." Vincent Russo was not the kind of man you found in the Yellow Pages. He specialized in what he called discrete information services, a euphemism for everything from background checks to surveillance to activities Derek preferred not to think about too carefully. They'd met through Derek's accountant, a weasel-faced man named Gerald, who had helped engineer the theft of Harold and Margaret's assets. "What kind of favor?" Vincent asked. "I need eyes on a property in West Virginia. My aunt and uncle are holed up there, and I want to know why." "West Virginia?" Vincent sounded skeptical. "That's outside my usual territory." "I'll pay double your normal rate." A pause. "Text me the address. I'll have someone there within 48 hours. Derek hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Something about this situation didn't feel right. Harold and Margaret should be broke, desperate, sleeping in shelters or begging relatives for help. Instead, they'd driven 7 hours to claim a property that had been sitting vacant for half a century. They knew something. They'd found something. Derek's mind raced through possibilities. Hidden cash, valuable antiques, some kind of family heirloom everyone had forgotten about. Whatever it was, it belonged to him. At least, that's how Derek saw it. He'd spent 2 years carefully dismantling his aunt and uncle's finances, and he wasn't about to let some last-minute discovery undo all his work. He opened a new browser tab and began researching Eleanor Whitmore. Back at the mansion, Harold and Margaret had made a decision. Before they contacted anyone on Eleanor's list, they needed to secure the property and make it livable. The underground spaces were comfortable enough. Eleanor had seen to that, but they couldn't stay hidden in a bunker forever. The house itself was in better condition than it appeared from outside. Eleanor, it seemed, had maintained the structural elements even as she let the cosmetic features decay. The roof was solid, reinforced with materials that wouldn't have been out of place on a military installation. The windows behind their rotted shutters were thick-tempered glass. The foundation showed no signs of cracking or settling. She wanted it to look abandoned, Harold realized on their 4th day. She maintained everything that mattered and let everything visible fall apart. Anyone driving by would think it was a ruin. Margaret nodded, understanding now the genius of her great-aunt's deception. hiding in plain sight. They set to work making the main floor habitable. Harold had always been handy. Decades of maintaining a trucking fleet had taught him every kind of repair, and Margaret knew how to stretch resources and prioritize tasks. They started with the kitchen, cleaning out decades of dust, testing the appliances Eleanor had installed, getting the water running again. The electricity was already working, fed by a generator system in a separate underground chamber. The fuel tanks, massive cylinders that could have powered a small town, were still 3/4 full. Eleanor had thought of everything. By the end of their first week, they had a functioning kitchen, a clean bedroom, and a living room where they could sit without fear of the furniture collapsing beneath them. It wasn't luxury, but it was home, more home than the shelter they'd been facing before. On day 8, they made their first outside contact. The attorney's name was Ruth Callahan, and her listing in Eleanor's notebook came with extensive notes. Trustworthy, old school, knows when to keep her mouth shut. Based in Wheeling, retired from practice in 2015, but still takes special cases. Tell her Eleanor sent you. She'll understand. Harold made the call from a landline phone they'd found in Eleanor's underground apartment, its cord snaking up through a conduit that connected to an exterior line. Callahan residence, a sharp voice answered on the third ring. Is this Ruth Callahan, the attorney? Retired attorney. Who's asking? Harold took a breath. My name is Harold Murphy. My wife Margaret recently inherited a property from her great-aunt Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor left a note saying you might be able to help us. Silence stretched across the line. Then, Eleanor Whitmore. Well, I'll be damned. I thought that woman would outlive us all. You knew her? Knew her? Honey, I helped her set up half the legal structures that protected her estate. We were friends for 30 years, right up until she passed. Ruth's voice softened. I always wondered when someone would come calling about that property. I just didn't expect to still be alive when it happened. Harold felt hope spark in his chest. We need help, Miss Callahan. We've found what Eleanor left behind and we don't know how to handle it properly. Another pause. You found the vault? Yes, ma'am. And you're calling me instead of running off to some bank or auction house, which means you actually read her instructions. Ruth chuckled. Eleanor always said the right person would know to be patient. Can you come see me tomorrow? There's a lot we need to discuss, and I don't trust phones for this kind of conversation. They agreed to meet at Ruth's home in Wheeling at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. When Harold hung up, he found Margaret watching him with anxious eyes. She knew Eleanor, he said. She helped set up the legal structures. She's willing to meet with us. Margaret exhaled slowly. So, we're really doing this. We're really going to figure out how to use what Eleanor left us. Harold crossed the room and took her hands in his. They were standing in the kitchen of a house they'd never visited before this week, miles from everything they knew, surrounded by secrets worth more than some small nation's treasuries. But in that moment, looking into his wife's eyes, Harold felt more grounded than he had in years. We're going to do more than that, he said. We're going to make sure no one ever takes anything from us again. Ruth Callahan lived in a modest Victorian on a quiet street in Wheeling's historic district. She was 83 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that still sparkled with sharp intelligence. She met them at the door herself, leaning on a carved wooden cane but standing straighter than many people half her age. Come in, she said, waving them toward a parlor filled with antique furniture and walls lined with legal books. I've been thinking about this meeting since you called. Sit down. I'll make tea. She disappeared into the kitchen before they could protest, returning 10 minutes later with a silver tray bearing a teapot and 3 china cups. The ritual of pouring and serving seemed to calm her, and when she finally settled into her own chair, she fixed them with an appraising look. So you're Eleanor's people, she said. I can see it in you. She always said her niece had honest eyes, same as yours, my dear. Margaret blushed slightly. I barely knew her, honestly. I was just a child when she died. She knew you, though. Kept tabs on you your whole life, through intermediaries. She knew when you got married, when you started your business, when you built it into something real. Ruth's expression turned grave. And she knew when that nephew of yours started pulling the rug out from under you. Harold's jaw tightened. She knew about Derek? She knew the kind of person he was, had him investigated about 5 years ago, when he first started showing signs of greed. She couldn't do anything directly, didn't want to interfere in your lives, but she made preparations. Ruth reached into a folder beside her chair and withdrew a thick envelope. This is one of them. Inside were legal documents, dozens of pages covered in dense type and official stamps. Harold flipped through them, understanding perhaps a third of what he was reading. What is this? Protection, Ruth said. When Eleanor set up the structures for her estate, she anticipated that whoever inherited it might face challenges, people trying to claim pieces that didn't belong to them, family members crawling out of the woodwork. So she created a series of trusts, each one layered on top of the others, each one designed to make the assets untouchable by anyone except the designated beneficiary. She pointed to a paragraph near the middle of the stack. That's you, Margaret. Your name has been in these documents since 1974, updated every few years to reflect changes in your legal status, marriage, name change, and so forth. Eleanor paid me a retainer for 50 years to maintain these records and keep them current. Margaret stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. She's been watching over me my whole life. In a sense, she didn't interfere, didn't try to guide you. She just made sure that when the time came, if it ever came, you would have options. Harold leaned forward. And Derek, the money he stole from us, can we get any of that back? Ruth's expression hardened. What he did to you was criminal, and there are legal avenues to pursue, but I won't lie. Cases like that take years, and the money is usually long gone by the time you get a judgment. She paused. However, what you have now changes the equation entirely. How so? You're no longer victims scraping for resources. You have the means to hire the best attorneys, the best investigators. You can pursue Derek with the kind of relentless pressure that most fraud victims can only dream of. Ruth smiled grimly. Eleanor used to say that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's outlasting your enemies while they destroy themselves. Over the next 3 hours, Ruth walked them through the practicalities of their situation. The trusts Eleanor had created meant that the vault's contents were legally theirs, beyond challenge or claim. Converting the assets would require patience and care. Gold could be sold through specialty dealers in small batches. Bonds could be redeemed through carefully chosen brokers. Coins and jewelry could be auctioned through reputable houses, but it was all possible. Start small, Ruth advised. Convert enough to stabilize your immediate situation, a few $100,000. Establish yourselves properly, get the house in order, create a paper trail that makes sense, then gradually bring the rest into the light over months or years. And the property itself? Harold asked. Can we secure it better? We're worried about visitors. Ruth nodded knowingly. Eleanor anticipated that too. There's a security system she had installed in 1988, state-of-the-art for its time. I can put you in touch with the firm that maintains it. They've been sending someone out every 6 months for the past 35 years, even though they had no idea what they were protecting. She reached into another folder and withdrew a business card. These people are the best at what they do. Tell them Ruth Callahan sent you, and that it's regarding the Whitmore account. They'll know what that means. By the time they left Ruth's house, the sun was setting over the West Virginia hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Harold and Margaret sat in their borrowed truck for a long moment, processing everything they'd learned. She really thought of everything, Margaret said softly. 50 years ago, she was already protecting us from things that hadn't happened yet. Harold started the engine. She gave us a foundation. Now it's up to us to build on it. They drove back toward the mountains, toward the house that had waited half a century for them to arrive, toward a future that had seemed impossible just 2 weeks ago. But neither of them noticed the nondescript sedan that had been parked across the street from Ruth's house, the one with the tinted windows and the out-of-state plates. And neither of them saw the man inside lift a camera with a telephoto lens and capture their faces as they drove away. Vincent Russo sent the photos to Derek that same evening, along with a detailed report. Subjects met with local attorney Ruth Callahan for approximately 3 hours. Callahan is 83, semi-retired, specializes in estate planning and trust administration. Whatever they discussed, it was serious. They came out looking like people who just got good news. Derek studied the photos on his laptop screen. His aunt and uncle looked different than he remembered. Not broken, not desperate, but hopeful. That was the word. They looked like people who had found something worth fighting for. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He picked up his phone and dialed Gerald's number. The accountant answered on the second ring. "We have a problem," Derek said. "My aunt and uncle found something at that property in West Virginia. Something valuable." Gerald's voice sharpened. "How valuable?" "I don't know yet, but they're meeting with attorneys and acting like they won the lottery. I need you to dig into the property records more thoroughly. Find out everything there is to know about Eleanor Whitmore, who she was, what she did, what she might have left behind. That could take time. Then work faster." Derek's voice hardened. "Whatever they found, it should be mine. I'm not letting 2 old fools who can't even protect their own bank accounts walk away with something that could set me up for life." He hung up and stared out at the ocean, waves crashing in the darkness like the sound of something inevitable approaching. Back at the Whitmore estate, Harold and Margaret were preparing for bed in the room they'd cleaned and furnished from Eleanor's stored supplies. It was modest. A mattress on a frame, clean sheets, a lamp on an overturned crate, but it felt more like home than anywhere they'd slept in weeks. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her silver hair, while Harold stood at the window looking out at the dark forest. "Do you think we're safe here?" she asked. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Safer than we were. Ruth's right. We need to get that security system activated, make this place fortress. But for now," he turned to look at her, "for now, we're hidden. No one knows what's here except us and Ruth. We have time." Margaret set down her brush and held out her hand. Harold crossed the room and took it, sitting beside her on the bed. 43 years, she said softly. 43 years of building something only to have it stolen. And now this. It doesn't feel real." "It's real," Harold said. "Eleanor made sure of that. She gave us a second chance, not just to survive, but to really live, to do something meaningful." Margaret leaned against his shoulder. "What do you want to do with it? All that money? What would you want?" Harold thought about it. About the trucking company they'd lost, the employees who'd been scattered to the winds when Derek sold everything off. About the house on Miller Road where they'd spent 38 years. About the betrayal that still burned in his chest like a coal that wouldn't go cold. "I want to make things right," he said finally. "For us, for the people Derek hurt when he destroyed our business, and I want to make sure he never does this to anyone else." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do." She kissed his cheek and lay back on the pillow, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. Harold stayed awake a while longer, listening to the wind in the trees outside, thinking about wolves and treasures and the strange paths that led people to their destinies. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called. The forest breathed around them, ancient and patient, and beneath their feet $271 million slept in its vault, waiting to see what they would make of this impossible second chance. 3 days after their meeting with Ruth, the security team arrived. They came in unmarked vans, 4 men and 2 women who moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had done this kind of work many times before. Their leader was a woman named Grace, late 40s, with close-cropped grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they touched. She walked the property with Harold and Margaret, asking questions, making notes, occasionally pausing to examine a window frame or test a door's strength. Eleanor was thorough, Grace said when the inspection was complete. The bones of a good system are already here. We just need to update it for modern threats. What kind of threats? Harold asked. Grace looked at him steadily. The kind that come when people discover you have something worth protecting. Motion sensors, cameras, reinforced access points, silent alarms connected to a private response team. If anyone approaches this property without authorization, we'll know about it within seconds. How much will all this cost? Grace smiled slightly. Less than you can afford, Mr. Murphy. Eleanor established a maintenance fund decades ago. It's been accumulating interest ever since. You're covered for the next 50 years at least. The installation took 4 days. When it was complete, the Whitmore estate had security that would have made some government facilities envious, all of it hidden behind the facade of decay that Eleanor had so carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, Margaret had begun the process Ruth outlined for converting their first assets. She selected a small batch of gold coins, common enough dates to avoid attracting numismatic attention, valuable enough to make a significant difference. Ruth arranged for a broker in Pittsburgh to handle the transaction, someone she'd worked with for decades. The sale went smoothly. $247,000 wired to a new account Ruth had helped them establish, minus the broker's fee and taxes. It wasn't a fortune by the standards of what they now possessed, but it was enough to change everything. Harold paid off the last of their debts, medical bills from his stroke, credit cards they'd run up trying to keep the trucking company afloat. He sent a check to Cal, their neighbor back in Ohio, to cover the borrowed truck and the weeks of hospitality. He bought them both new clothes, proper winter coats, sturdy boots for walking the mountain property, and he began making plans. "We need to rebuild our lives," he told Margaret one evening as they sat in the parlor, a fire crackling in the restored fireplace. "Not just survive, really build something new, something that matters." Margaret looked up from Eleanor's journal, which she'd been reading through for the 3rd time. Eleanor wrote about that, near the end in one of her last entries. She found the page and read aloud. "Wealth without purpose is poison. It corrodes the soul, breeds paranoia, turns allies into enemies and family into strangers. If someone inherits what I have built, I hope they understand this. The money is not the treasure. The treasure is what you do with it. Give, build, protect. Create something that outlasts you. Something that matters." Harold nodded slowly. "She was wise, your aunt." "She was lonely," Margaret said softly. "All those years, all that brilliance, and she spent most of her life alone, hiding, protecting secrets that no one else knew existed." She closed the journal. "I don't want that for us, Harold. I don't want to spend whatever years we have left hiding in a mountain fortress, counting gold bars." "What do you want?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I want to help people. People like us. People who got cheated, who lost everything to someone they trusted. Derek isn't unique, Harold. There are thousands of people every year who get swindled by family members, by accountants, by people who were supposed to protect them." Harold reached out and took her hand. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll figure out how to use Eleanor's gift to protect people who can't protect themselves." It was a promise, sealed in the firelight of a house that had waited 50 years for this moment, and it was a promise they intended to keep. But 600 miles away, in a beachfront condo in Florida, Derek Murphy was making promises of his own. He'd received Gerald's report that afternoon. The accountant had dug deep into Eleanor Whitmore's history, piecing together fragments from public records, old newspaper clippings, and discreet inquiries made through less than legal channels. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but suggestive. Eleanor Whitmore had worked in Washington during the Cold War, had connections to wealthy families across the East Coast, had purchased the mountain property in the early 60s, and done extensive renovation work that seemed inconsistent with a simple family home. "There's no proof of anything," Gerald said over the phone, "but the pattern suggests she was involved in some kind of asset protection scheme, helping rich people hide money from the government, probably." Derek's eyes gleamed. And if she was hiding other people's money, she might have been hiding her own as well. Derek stood and walked to his window, watching the waves roll in. "That property has been sitting there for 50 years. No one's touched it. And now my aunt and uncle show up, and suddenly they're meeting with attorneys and acting like everything's fine. You think they found something?" "I think they found everything." Derek's voice hardened. "And I'm going to find out exactly what it is." He hung up and made another call. This time to a lawyer he knew in West Virginia, someone who specialized in property disputes and wasn't too particular about the ethics of his clients. "I need you to research a property in Appalachian County," Derek said. "The Whitmore estate. Find me any legal angle I can use to claim a stake in it." The lawyer hesitated. "On what grounds?" "On any grounds. Family connection, improper transfer, whatever you can find. I don't care if it's a long shot. I just need a toehold." There was a pause. "That kind of research takes time and money." "I have both." Derek smiled coldly. "And I'm very motivated." He hung up and returned to his computer, pulling up the photos Vincent had sent. His aunt and uncle, looking hopeful and determined, walking out of an attorney's office. "Enjoy it while you can," Derek thought. "Whatever you found in that mountain, it's going to be mine." He just had to figure out how. The wolves came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Harold and Margaret had first descended into Eleanor's vault. The security system Grace had installed detected them first. 2 vehicles approaching on County Road 47, moving slowly, deliberately, like predators stalking prey. Harold was in the kitchen making coffee when the alert chimed on the tablet Grace had left them. He picked it up and watched the camera feeds, his stomach tightening. A black SUV and a silver sedan. The SUV he didn't recognize, but the sedan, something about its shape, its color, triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. "Margaret," he called softly, "we have visitors." She came from the parlor, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and looked over his shoulder at the screen. Her face went pale. "That's Derek's car," she whispered. "The silver one. I'd know it anywhere." Harold's jaw tightened. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it ever since Ruth Callahan explained the legal protections Eleanor had put in place. But knowing something intellectually and facing it in reality were 2 very different things. "Stay inside," he said. "I'll handle this." "Harold, no, you can't." "I'm not hiding from him, Maggie." Harold's voice was steady, but his eyes held a fire she hadn't seen in years. "He stole everything from us. Our home, our business, our dignity. I won't let him take this too." He walked to the front door, grabbed his coat from the hook and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. He stood at the top of the steps, arms crossed, and waited. The vehicles pulled up the long driveway and stopped about 50 feet from the house. Derek emerged from the sedan first, wearing an expensive coat and the same smile he'd worn every Sunday dinner for 20 years, the smile that had hidden a thief's heart. Behind him came 2 other men. One was thin and weasel-faced, clutching a leather briefcase like it contained the Holy Grail. The other was large, broad-shouldered, with the look of hired muscle poorly disguised in business casual. "Uncle Harold," Derek called out, spreading his arms wide like he was greeting an old friend. "It's so good to see you. I've been worried sick since you disappeared from Ohio." Harold didn't move. "You weren't worried. You were hoping we'd die quietly so you wouldn't have to deal with the loose ends. Derek's smile flickered but held. That's hurtful, Uncle. After everything I did for you, managing the business, handling your finances when you were too sick to do it yourself. You mean stealing everything we spent 43 years building? Harold's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. You mean forging documents and draining our accounts and selling our home out from under us? The weasel-faced man stepped forward, opening his briefcase. Mr. Murphy, my name is Gerald Hayes. I'm Mr. Derek Murphy's financial advisor. I think there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of the asset transfers. There's no misunderstanding, Harold said flatly. Your client is a thief and a liar, and you helped him do it. Now get off my property. Derek's smile finally cracked. The charm fell away, revealing something cold and hard beneath. Your property, he said softly. That's interesting, Uncle, because I have documents here that suggest otherwise. He reached into his coat and withdrew a manila envelope, holding it up like evidence. According to these papers, Aunt Margaret signed over her inheritance rights to this property in 2019. She was experiencing early-stage dementia at the time, and as her concerned nephew, I helped her manage her affairs. This property, and everything on it, legally belongs to me. Harold felt the words hit him like physical blows, but he didn't flinch. He'd spent too many years negotiating with suppliers, dealing with difficult clients, facing down problems that seemed insurmountable. He knew a bluff when he saw one. Those documents are forged, he said calmly, just like the ones you used to steal our house in Ohio. And unlike back then, we have lawyers now. Good ones, the kind who know how to spot fraud. Derek's eyes narrowed. You have lawyers? With what money? Last I checked, your accounts were empty. Things change. For a long moment they stood there, nephew and uncle, separated by 50 feet of gravel and a lifetime of betrayal. The hired muscle shifted uncomfortably. Gerald, the accountant, clutched his briefcase tighter. Then Derek laughed. It was a cold sound, hollow. You found something, he said slowly, didn't you? Something in this old wreck of a house, something valuable. Harold said nothing. That's why you came here. That's why you're meeting with attorneys and acting like you own the world. Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping. What is it, Uncle? Antiques? Old stocks? Maybe some cash the crazy old aunt hid under her mattress? I think you should leave now, Harold said. I think I should see what's inside that house. Derek gestured to his muscle. Marcus, help my uncle understand that I'm not asking. The big man started forward. Harold didn't move from the porch steps. You take one more step onto this property, Harold said quietly, and you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. Marcus hesitated, looking back at Derek. The younger man nodded impatiently. He's 72 years old. What's he going to do? Marcus shrugged and continued forward. He got about 10 feet before the sirens started. Not actual sirens, the security system's perimeter alarm triggered by unauthorized entry onto the grounds. The sound was loud, piercing, designed to disorient and intimidate. Marcus froze. Derek's head whipped around, searching for the source. From inside the house, Margaret's voice came through an intercom speaker Grace had installed. Appalachian County Sheriff's Department has been automatically notified. They'll be here in 8 minutes. Derek's face contorted with rage. You're bluffing. Try me, Harold said. For a long, terrible moment, Harold thought Derek might call the bluff anyway, might order his man forward regardless of consequences. The look in his nephew's eyes was something Harold had never seen before, pure, concentrated greed mixed with desperation. But then Gerald stepped forward, tugging at Derek's sleeve. We should go. This isn't the right approach. We can pursue this through legal channels. Derek shook off his hand but didn't advance. Instead, he pointed at Harold, his finger trembling with barely contained fury. This isn't over, he said. Whatever you found here, it belongs to me. I'm going to get lawyers, investigators, whatever it takes. I'm going to prove that this property was transferred to me, and then I'm going to tear this place apart piece by piece until I find what you're hiding." Harold stood his ground. "You do what you have to do, and we'll do what we have to do." Derek turned and stalked back to his car, his entourage following. The vehicles reversed down the driveway, faster than they'd come, and disappeared through the gate. Only then did Harold allow himself to exhale. His hands were shaking, his heart was pounding, but he was still standing. Margaret burst through the front door and wrapped her arms around him. "Harold, are you okay? I was so scared." "I'm fine," he said, holding her tight. "But we need to call Ruth. This is just the beginning." Ruth Callahan arrived at the Whitmore estate 2 hours later, having received their urgent call. She sat in the parlor, listening to their account of the confrontation, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Forged inheritance documents," she said when they finished, claiming Margaret signed over her rights in 2019. "That's bold, even for someone like him." "Is there any way it could work?" Margaret asked anxiously. "Could he actually claim this property?" Ruth shook her head firmly. Eleanor anticipated exactly this kind of attack. When she established the trust structure, she included something called a challenge provision. Any attempt to contest Margaret's inheritance triggers an automatic review by a panel of 3 independent attorneys, all pre-selected by Eleanor, all bound by strict confidentiality agreements. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "These are the original trust documents, with Margaret's name added in 1974. They've been updated every 5 years since, verified by 3 different law firms in 3 different states. They include notarized statements, witnessed signatures, and dated photographs, proving that Margaret never signed any transfer of rights." Harold leaned forward. "So Derek's documents are worthless?" "Worse than worthless. They're evidence of attempted fraud." Ruth's eyes glinted. "If he tries to file anything based on those forgeries, he'll be walking into a trap. We can use his own documents against him." "But he won't stop," Margaret said quietly. "You didn't see his face, Ruth. This isn't about the property anymore. He knows we found something valuable, and he won't rest until he gets it." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then we need to be prepared for a longer fight. Derek will try other approaches, harassment, intimidation, maybe even legal maneuvers designed to drain your resources and wear you down. We need to be ready for all of it." Over the next 2 weeks, Derek made good on his threat. First came the private investigators. Harold spotted them the second day. 2 men in a nondescript van parked on the county road, watching the property through binoculars. The security system tracked their movements, and Grace's team monitored them from a distance. They started asking questions in town, at the diner, at the general store, at the post office. Who were these people at the Whitmore place? How long had they been there? Had anyone seen anything unusual? Most of the locals had never heard of Harold and Margaret Murphy, but they knew the Whitmore estate, knew the stories about the crazy old woman who'd lived there decades ago, and they didn't much appreciate outsiders coming around asking questions. "Fellow came in yesterday," said the owner of the hardware store when Harold stopped by for supplies. "City type, expensive shoes. Wanted to know all about your property. Asked if I'd seen any trucks coming or going, any unusual activity." Harold tensed. "What did you tell him?" The man shrugged. "Told him to mind his own business. We don't much care for people poking around where they don't belong." It was the same story everywhere. The Appalachian community was tight-knit, suspicious of outsiders, protective of their own. And somehow, word had spread about the elderly couple who'd arrived at the old Whitmore place after being cheated out of everything by their own nephew. "Heard what happened to you folks," said the woman at the post office. "My sister's husband. He got swindled by his brother back in '93, nearly destroyed him. You need anything, you let us know." Harold was touched by the support, but worried about its limits. These were good people, but they were also farmers and shopkeepers with their own problems. They couldn't stand against someone with Derek's resources forever. The harassment escalated. Mysterious calls to the property, hang-ups in the middle of the night. A letter arrived threatening legal action over unpaid property taxes that didn't actually exist. Someone tried to file a lien against the estate based on fabricated debts. Ruth batted away each attack with the patience of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, but the strain was telling on all of them. Then came the final confrontation. It was a Saturday evening, nearly a month after the first encounter. Harold and Margaret were sitting down to dinner when the security system chimed. This time, it wasn't just one vehicle, it was 3, and they weren't stopping at the gate. "They're coming through," Margaret said, watching the tablet with wide eyes. "Harold, they're forcing the gate." Harold grabbed the phone and dialed 911, speaking quickly and calmly to the dispatcher. Then he called Grace's emergency line, relaying the situation in clipped sentences. Finally, he turned to Margaret. "Go to the vault," he said. "Lock yourself in. Don't come out until I come get you." "I'm not leaving you." "Maggie, please." His voice cracked. "Whatever happens, you have to be safe. Everything we've worked for, everything Eleanor left us, it's all pointless if something happens to you." She held his face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love you, Harold Murphy." "I love you too. Now go." She ran toward the pantry, toward the hidden stairs, while Harold walked to the front door for the second time in a month. This time, Derek wasn't pretending to be friendly. 5 men emerged from the vehicles. Derek, Gerald, Marcus, and 2 others Harold didn't recognize. They weren't dressed for negotiation. They were dressed for force. "Last chance, Uncle," Derek called out as he approached. "Invite us in, show us what you're hiding, and maybe we can work something out. Otherwise," he gestured to his men, "things get ugly." Harold stood on the porch, his 72-year-old body trembling but his voice steady. "The sheriff is on the way. You have maybe 5 minutes before you're all arrested." "Then we better work fast." Derek nodded to Marcus. "Get him out of the way." The big man moved up the steps. Harold didn't run. Couldn't run, even if he'd wanted to. He stood his ground as Marcus grabbed his shoulder and shoved. Harold fell hard, his hips striking the porch boards, his ribs cracking against the railing. Pain exploded through his body, white-hot and blinding. He heard himself cry out, heard Derek shouting something, heard footsteps rushing toward the door. Then he heard something else. Tires on gravel, multiple vehicles, and a voice, amplified by a megaphone. "This is the Appalachian County Sheriff's Department. All individuals on the property, freeze and put your hands where we can see them." Derek spun around. Behind him, 3 sheriff's cruisers had appeared, lights flashing, deputies emerging with hands on their weapons. But they weren't the only ones. Pickup trucks were pulling up behind the cruisers, 5, 6, 7 of them. Local farmers and shopkeepers, the same people who had told Derek's investigators to mind their own business. They climbed out of their vehicles, not armed, not threatening, but present, witnesses, a community that had decided to protect its own. "What the hell is this?" Derek sputtered. One of the deputies approached, hand on his holster. "Sir, I need you to step away from the house immediately. You're on private property without authorization." "I have authorization. This property belongs to me." "According to our records, this property belongs to Margaret Murphy, née Whitmore. You're trespassing." Another deputy was already helping Harold to his feet, calling for medical assistance. The old man's face was grey with pain, but his eyes found Derek's across the chaos. "You're done," Harold said quietly. "It's over." Derek's face twisted with fury. "This isn't over. I'll sue everyone here. Derek Murphy?" A third voice, calm and official. A woman in a dark suit had emerged from one of the sheriff's vehicles. Not a deputy, someone else entirely. "I'm Special Agent Torres with the FBI. You're under arrest for wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines." She recited his rights while Derek stood frozen, his expensive coat suddenly looking cheap, his confident posture crumbling like old paper. Gerald tried to run. He made it about 10 feet before 2 farmers blocked his path, arms crossed, faces impassive. He turned the other way and found a deputy waiting with handcuffs. Marcus and the others surrendered without resistance. They were hired hands, not true believers, and they knew a lost cause when they saw one. As the deputies loaded Derek into a cruiser, Harold watched from the porch where a paramedic was examining his ribs. The pain was still there, sharp and insistent, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like justice. Margaret appeared at his side, having emerged from the vault when she heard the all clear. She knelt beside him, her face streaked with tears. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're okay." They took Harold to the hospital in Wheeling. 2 cracked ribs, extensive bruising, but nothing life-threatening. Margaret sat beside his bed through the night, holding his hand, watching him sleep. Ruth Callahan arrived the next morning, looking tired but triumphant. She carried a folder thick with documents. "How is he?" she asked. "Stubborn," Margaret said with a weak smile. "The doctors say he'll be fine in a few weeks." Ruth nodded, then pulled a chair close to the bed. Harold was awake now, groggy from pain medication, but alert enough to listen. "I just came from a meeting with the federal prosecutors," Ruth said. "They've been building a case against Derek for months, ever since you filed that initial police report back in Ohio. What happened last night gave them everything they needed to make an arrest." "Months?" Harold blinked. "We only filed that report 6 weeks ago." Ruth smiled slightly. "You filed a report, but others had filed before you. Turns out you weren't Derek's first victims, just his biggest. He's been running variations of this scheme for years, targeting elderly relatives, business partners, anyone he thought was vulnerable." Margaret's hand tightened on Harold's. "How many people?" "At least 7 that we know of. Probably more who never came forward." Ruth opened her folder. "The federal investigation started 2 years ago, but they couldn't get enough evidence for an arrest. Your case gave them the paper trail they needed, and last night's attempted assault gave them the excuse to act." Harold processed this slowly. The man he'd loved like a son, whom he'd trusted with everything, had been a predator all along, had probably been planning this from the moment he walked into their lives. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now Derek faces trial, federal charges for the financial crimes, state charges for last night's assault. If convicted, he's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum." Ruth's expression softened. "And more importantly for you, the assets he stole are being traced. It will take time, but there's a good chance you'll recover at least some of what he took." Margaret shook her head slowly. "We don't need it. Not anymore." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You don't want your money back?" "It's not about the money." Margaret looked at Harold, then back at Ruth. "We spent 43 years building that trucking company. Derek didn't just steal our finances. He destroyed something we created together, something we were proud of. No amount of recovered funds can bring that back." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But Eleanor gave us something new, a chance to build again, to create something that matters. That's what we want to focus on now. Not revenge, not recovery, purpose." Ruth studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Eleanor would have been proud to hear you say that." She reached into her folder again and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "Speaking of which, there's something else you should know. The federal investigators want to meet with you, both of you, when Harold is well enough. They're not just interested in Derek." "What do you mean?" Harold asked. "They've uncovered evidence that Derek wasn't working alone. There's a network, accountants, lawyers, shell companies, all designed to facilitate elder fraud on a massive scale. The FBI wants to use what you've learned, what Eleanor taught you about asset protection, to help identify and dismantle similar schemes across the country." Harold and Margaret looked at each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Harold laughed, a real laugh, despite the pain in his ribs. Eleanor said we should use her gift to help people who couldn't protect themselves. I don't think she meant becoming consultants for the FBI. Maybe not, Ruth said, but I think she'd approve. The wolves always come. That's what she believed. The only defense is making sure good people are ready to fight back. Through the hospital window, morning light was breaking over the West Virginia hills. Somewhere out there, the Whitmore estate stood silent and strong, its secrets safe, its purpose waiting to be fulfilled. And in that small hospital room, two people who had lost everything found themselves holding something more valuable than gold or bonds or rare coins. They held hope, they held purpose, they held each other. The wolves had come, and the wolves had lost. The trial of Derek Murphy began on a cold February morning, 4 months after his arrest on the grounds of the Whitmore estate. Harold sat in the federal courthouse in Charleston, West Virginia, his ribs long healed, but the memory of that night still fresh. Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. They had not wanted to attend. The thought of facing Derek again, of sitting in the same room as the man who had betrayed them so completely, had kept Margaret awake for nights. But Ruth Callahan had convinced them it was important. "This isn't just about Derek anymore," she had said. "It's about everyone he hurt. Your presence shows them they're not alone." So they came. And they were not alone either. The courtroom was packed. Federal prosecutors had spent months building their case, connecting Derek's scheme against Harold and Margaret to a web of fraud that stretched across 7 states. Witnesses filled the gallery. Other victims, some elderly and frail, others younger but equally devastated. Family members who had trusted and been betrayed. Business partners who had watched their life's work disappear. Derek sat at the defense table in a prison jumpsuit, his expensive clothes and confident smile long gone. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. When his eyes met Harold's across the courtroom, something passed between them. Not hatred, not forgiveness, just the weight of what had been lost. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed systematic theft spanning 5 years. Forged documents bore Derek's fingerprints. Email chains revealed calculated plans to exploit his aunt and uncle's trust. Gerald Hayes, the accountant, had turned state's witness in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing testimony that connected every piece of the puzzle. But it was the victim impact statements that broke something open in the room. A woman named Dorothy, 78 years old, described how Derek had convinced her to sign over her late husband's pension. She now lived in a nursing home she couldn't afford, dependent on Medicaid and the charity of strangers. A man named William, 81, told how Derek had befriended him at church, slowly gaining his trust over 2 years before draining his savings account. William's voice cracked as he described losing his home of 47 years. And then it was Margaret's turn. She walked to the podium slowly, her hands steady, her voice clear. She didn't look at Derek. She looked at the jury, at the judge, at the faces of the other victims scattered throughout the gallery. 43 years, she began. That's how long my husband and I spent building our business. We started with nothing, a single truck and a dream. We worked 16-hour days. We missed vacations and holidays. We sacrificed everything because we believed that hard work and honesty would be rewarded. She paused, gathering herself. Derek came into our lives when he was 11 years old. He was scared and alone, and we loved him immediately. We raised him as our own. We paid for his education, supported his career, welcomed him into every part of our lives. When my husband had his stroke, we trusted Derek to help us. We gave him power of attorney because we believed he was family. Her voice hardened slightly. He used that trust to destroy everything we had built. He forged our signatures, drained our accounts, sold our home out from under us. By the time we discovered what he had done, we had nothing. We were facing homelessness at 72 and 69 years old. She finally turned to look at Derek. He wouldn't meet her eyes. I don't hate you, Derek. I don't have room in my heart for hatred anymore. But I want you to understand something. What you stole from us wasn't just money. It was our security, our dignity, our faith in family. It was 43 years of work reduced to ashes. It was sleepless nights wondering how we would survive. She turned back to the jury. We were fortunate. Through circumstances I never expected, we found a way forward. But most of your victims weren't so lucky. Dorothy lost her independence. William lost his home. Others lost their will to live. You didn't just steal money, Derek. You stole hope. And for that, there is no dollar amount that can make things right. She returned to her seat beside Harold, who took her hand and held it tight. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of someone crying in the gallery. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: federal wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, money laundering, assault. The sentencing came 2 weeks later, 22 years in federal prison. As the deputies led Derek away, he finally looked at his aunt and uncle. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. Harold and Margaret sat in the empty courtroom for a long time after everyone else had left. The weight of the past year pressed down on them, the betrayal, the discovery, the fear, the fight. It was over now. Finally, truly over. "What do we do now?" Harold asked quietly. Margaret squeezed his hand. "We go home, and we build something worth building." Spring came early to the Appalachian Mountains that year. The snow melted in late February, and by March, the forest around the Whitmore estate was coming alive with birdsong and budding trees. Harold stood on the porch of the mansion, cleaned now, restored, no longer hiding behind a facade of decay, and watched the sunrise paint the hills in shades of gold and rose. 6 months had passed since Derek's sentencing. In that time, Harold and Margaret had made decisions that would have seemed impossible a year ago. The first decision was what to do with the vault. They had spent weeks discussing it, debating options, consulting with Ruth and the team of advisors she had assembled. They could have simply converted everything to conventional assets, sold the gold, cashed the bonds, liquidated the collections. They could have become quietly wealthy, living out their remaining years in comfort and security. But that wasn't what Eleanor had intended, and it wasn't what they wanted. She wrote that wealth without purpose is poison, Margaret said one evening as they sat in the parlor, Eleanor's journal open between them. She spent her whole life accumulating this fortune, and in the end, she was alone. We have a chance to do something different. Harold nodded slowly. What are you thinking? A foundation. Something that uses Eleanor's gift to help people like us, people who've been cheated, betrayed, taken advantage of by those they trusted. Margaret's eyes were bright with conviction. Legal aid for elder fraud victims, financial education programs, scholarships for young people who want to study law or accounting or social work. We could make a real difference. It took 3 months to establish the Whitmore Foundation. Ruth Callahan served as the first board chair, bringing her decades of legal experience and her network of trusted colleagues. They hired a small staff, a director, a financial manager, 2 caseworkers, and set up offices in the renovated east wing of the mansion. The mission was simple: protect the vulnerable and empower them to protect themselves. The Foundation's first major initiative was a legal aid program for elderly victims of financial exploitation. Working with law schools across West Virginia and neighboring states, they established clinics where seniors could get free legal consultations, help filing complaints, and representation in civil cases. In the first year alone, they assisted over 300 families. The second initiative was educational. They partnered with community centers and senior living facilities to offer workshops on financial literacy, estate planning, and recognizing the signs of fraud. Harold led many of these sessions himself, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale. "Trust is a beautiful thing," he would tell the attendees, "but trust without verification is dangerous. Always get a second opinion. Always read what you sign, and never, ever give someone power over your finances without safeguards in place." The third initiative was the one closest to Margaret's heart: scholarships for students pursuing careers in elder protection. Law students, social workers, financial advisors, anyone committed to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. They funded 20 scholarships the first year, with plans to expand as the foundation's investments grew. But the foundation wasn't the only transformation taking place. The mansion itself had become something new. The main floor, fully restored now, served as a museum and community center. Eleanor's story was told through carefully curated exhibits, photographs from her years in Washington, documents explaining the Cold War context of her work, explanations of how she built her vault and why. The vault itself remained sealed, its exact contents known only to Harold, Margaret, and a small circle of trusted advisors. But a replica had been constructed on the main floor, allowing visitors to understand the scope of what Eleanor had created without compromising the security of the actual assets. She would have hated being famous, Margaret told a reporter from the Charleston Gazette who had come to cover the museum's opening. She spent her whole life avoiding attention, but I think she would have understood why we're sharing her story. People need to know that one person, working quietly and patiently, can make a difference that lasts for generations. The museum attracted visitors from across the region. School groups studying local history, seniors curious about the woman who had lived alone in the mountains, financial professionals interested in the unconventional asset protection strategies Eleanor had pioneered. On weekends, the grounds hosted community events, farmers' markets, craft fairs, concerts featuring local musicians. The isolation that had defined the property for 50 years was gone. In its place was connection, community, purpose. Harold and Margaret didn't live in the mansion. They never had any desire for that kind of grandeur. Instead, they renovated a small cottage at the edge of the property, a 2-bedroom structure that had once been a groundskeeper's quarters. They painted it pale blue, planted a garden out front, and hung a porch swing where they could sit together in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. It was simple, it was peaceful, it was home. The letters started arriving about 6 months after the foundation was established. At first, there were just a few, handwritten notes from people who had read about the Murphys in the newspaper or seen them interviewed on local television. Thank you letters from families the foundation had helped. Expressions of gratitude from scholarship recipients. Then the Derek Murphy trial verdict was covered by national media, and the trickle became a flood. Letters from every state in the country. Emails by the hundreds. Phone calls that the foundation staff could barely keep up with. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been hurt. Everyone was looking for someone who understood. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Murphy," one letter began. "I am writing to you from California. My mother is 83 years old, and my brother has been stealing from her for years. No one believes me. The police won't help. I don't know what to do. Please, if there is any way you can help us." Another. "I saw your story on the news and cried for an hour. The same thing happened to my grandparents. They lost everything, and my uncle never faced any consequences. Knowing that you fought back and won gives me hope that maybe there's still justice in this world." And another. "I'm a law student at West Virginia University, and I want to dedicate my career to helping people like you. How can I get involved with the Whitmore Foundation?" Margaret read every letter herself. She couldn't help it. Each one felt like a thread connecting her to someone who had walked the same dark road she and Harold had traveled. Some letters made her cry, some made her angry. All of them reinforced her conviction that the work they were doing mattered. One letter, though, changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, nearly a year after the foundation had opened its doors. Margaret was in her cottage, sorting through the day's mail, when she came across an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but something about it made her pause. She opened it carefully and began to read. "Dear Mrs. Murphy, my name is Helen, and I am 81 years old. I live in a small town in Nebraska, and I have been alone for 3 years since my husband passed. I am writing to you because I have no one else to turn to. My daughter Angela came back into my life 2 years ago. She had been estranged for a long time, problems with drugs and bad relationships, but she said she had changed. She said she wanted to take care of me. I was so happy to have her back. 6 months ago, Angela convinced me to add her to my bank accounts so she could help pay my bills. Last week, I discovered that she has withdrawn over $47,000. That was everything I had. My husband's life insurance, our savings, the money we set aside for emergencies. When I confronted her, she laughed at me. She said there was nothing I could do about it. She said no one would believe a confused old woman over her own daughter. I don't know what to do. I can't afford a lawyer. The police said it was a civil matter. My other children live far away and don't have the resources to help. I am facing eviction from my apartment in 3 weeks. I saw your story on the internet, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. You know what this feels like. You understand what it means to be betrayed by someone you love. Please, if there is anything you can do, any advice you can give, I would be so grateful. I am not asking for money. I just need someone to tell me I am not crazy, that what happened to me was wrong, and that there might be a way forward. Thank you for reading this. Thank you for giving me hope. Sincerely, Helen." Margaret sat for a long time after finishing the letter, tears streaming down her face. Helen's words echoed in her mind. I just need someone to tell me I am not crazy. How many times had she felt the same way in those dark weeks after discovering what Derek had done? She found Harold in the garden, pruning the rose bushes Margaret had planted in the spring. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, his expression growing heavier with each line. When he finished, he looked up at his wife. "We have to help her," he said quietly. "I know. It's not just about the money. It's about—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's about not being alone," Margaret finished. "It's about knowing that someone out there cares what happens to you." Harold nodded. "Call Ruth. Let's see what we can do." 3 weeks later, Helen's eviction was stopped. Foundation attorneys had filed an emergency motion arguing that the withdrawal of funds constituted elder financial abuse. A temporary restraining order prevented Angela from accessing any of her mother's remaining assets, and a case was opened with the Nebraska Attorney General's office. Helen herself was moved to safer housing, a small apartment in a senior community where she would have support and supervision. The foundation covered her first 6 months of rent and connected her with local social services that could help her rebuild her life. Margaret called her personally to deliver the news. "I don't understand," Helen said, her voice breaking. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Margaret smiled, though Helen couldn't see it. "Because someone did it for us. Because that's what the money is for. And because you're not a stranger, Helen. You're family now. The family that understands what it means to be hurt and to heal." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, softly, "Thank you. Thank you so much." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her cottage and looked out the window at the mountains she had come to love. The trees were bare now, winter approaching, but there was beauty in their skeletal branches reaching toward the grey sky. There was life waiting beneath the frozen ground, ready to bloom again when spring arrived. Eleanor had written that the greatest wealth was not what we held, but what we gave. Margaret understood that now in a way she never had before. The vault beneath the mansion still held millions of dollars in gold and bonds and rare treasures. But the real treasure was this: the ability to reach across distance and suffering and tell another human being, "You matter. You are not alone. There is hope." The years that followed were full ones. The Whitmore Foundation grew beyond anything Harold and Margaret had imagined. What started as a small operation in the east wing of an Appalachian mansion became a national organization with offices in 12 states. They trained hundreds of legal advocates, educated thousands of seniors about financial safety, and helped countless families navigate the aftermath of betrayal. The Murphy story became a touchstone, a symbol of resilience that resonated with people across the country. Journalists wrote about them. Documentary filmmakers requested interviews. A best-selling author approached them about writing their biography. They turned most of it down. They didn't want fame, they didn't need recognition, they just wanted to do the work. But they did agree to speak publicly on occasion, at conferences, at congressional hearings, at community gatherings where their presence could make a difference. Harold, despite his age, became a surprisingly effective advocate, his plain-spoken manner and obvious integrity cutting through political noise. "We were lucky," he would say. "We had resources most people don't have, but luck shouldn't be required for justice. Every person who is cheated by someone they trust deserves protection, deserves support, deserves a path forward. That's what we're fighting for." Margaret focused more on the personal side, corresponding with families the foundation had helped, visiting senior centers, mentoring young advocates who reminded her of the person she might have been if she'd discovered her purpose earlier in life. Eleanor spent decades working alone, she told one young lawyer who had joined the foundation staff. "She was brilliant, but she was isolated. I don't want that for you. This work is hard enough without carrying it by yourself. Lean on your colleagues, lean on me. We're stronger together." Ruth Callahan remained a constant presence, her sharp legal mind and decades of experience invaluable even as she approached 90. She trained her successors carefully, building institutional knowledge that would outlast any individual. "Eleanor chose well when she chose you too," Ruth said one evening, sitting with Harold and Margaret on their cottage porch as the sun set over the mountains. "But I think she would be most proud of this. Not the money you've spent or the people you've helped, but the fact that you've built something that will continue long after we're all gone." Harold reached for Margaret's hand. "We couldn't have done any of it without you, Ruth." The older woman smiled. "Nonsense. I just pointed you in the right direction. You did all the walking." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. Three people who had come together through strange circumstances and built something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayal. On their 50th wedding anniversary, Harold surprised Margaret with a simple gift, a new plaque for Eleanor's desk in the Vault Museum. It read, "Eleanor Whitmore built this vault to protect what mattered. Harold and Margaret Murphy opened it to share what matters more. The treasure is not gold or silver. The treasure is hope." Margaret wept when she saw it. Then she laughed. Then she kissed her husband of 5 decades and told him it was perfect. The following spring, they received word that Derek had applied for early parole. The request was denied unanimously, with the parole board citing the scope of his crimes and his lack of demonstrated remorse. He would serve at least 15 more years. Harold felt nothing when he heard the news. No satisfaction, no anger, no grief. Derek had become a stranger, someone who had once been part of their lives and was now simply gone. The wound he had inflicted had healed, leaving a scar but no longer causing pain. "Do you ever think about forgiving him?" Margaret asked one night. Harold considered the question carefully. "I don't think about him much at all anymore. But forgiveness," he paused. "I've let go of the anger. I've let go of the need for revenge. Whether that's forgiveness, I don't know. Maybe it's just moving on. Margaret nodded. Eleanor wrote something about that in her journal. She said holding on to hatred was like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to die. I think about that sometimes. Wise woman, your aunt. She was. I wish I'd known her better. Harold put his arm around his wife. I think she knows you now. Wherever she is, whatever comes after this life, I think she sees what you've done with her gift, and I think she's proud. The last letter arrived on a Tuesday, much like the first. Margaret was 91 years old now, her hair white as snow, her hands marked with age spots, but her eyes still bright with the fire that had carried her through more than 2 decades of foundation work. Harold had passed 3 years earlier, peacefully, in his sleep, in the cottage they had shared for so long. She missed him every day. But she was not alone. The foundation had grown beyond anything she could manage directly. Younger leaders had taken over the day-to-day operations, guided by the principles she and Harold had established. The Whitmore estate had become a landmark, visited by thousands each year, its story told and retold until it had become part of the region's identity. Margaret spent most of her time now in the cottage, reading, corresponding with old friends, and watching the seasons change over the mountains she had come to love. Foundation staff checked on her daily. Visitors came often. Scholars, journalists, families who had been helped over the years, and young advocates who wanted to hear her stories firsthand. But on this particular Tuesday, the letter that arrived was different. It was from a woman in Ohio, a place Margaret hadn't thought about in years. The return address was in a town called Miller Road, the same town where she and Harold had lived before Derek's betrayal, before everything changed. She opened it with trembling fingers. Dear Mrs. Murphy, my name is Sarah, and I am 34 years old. I am writing to you because I recently learned something that I think you should know. My grandmother was Dorothy Chen, one of the victims who testified at Derek Murphy's trial. She passed away 2 years ago, but before she died, she told me about you and Mr. Murphy. She said that your foundation helped her when no one else would, and that she considered you both angels sent to earth. But that's not why I'm writing. I'm writing because I've just completed law school, and I've accepted a position with your foundation's Ohio office. I start next month. I wanted you to know that when I was a little girl, I watched my grandmother suffer. I watched her lose everything to a man who pretended to be her friend. I watched her cry herself to sleep, wondering if anyone in the world cared what happened to her, and then I watched her get better. I watched her regain her dignity, her hope, her will to live. She told me it was because of people like you, people who refused to look away, who believed that everyone deserves protection and justice. I decided then that I would dedicate my life to this work. I studied hard, I went to law school, and now I'm here, ready to help others the way you helped my grandmother. I know you probably receive thousands of letters, and I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know that what you and Mr. Murphy built, it matters. It changed my grandmother's life. It changed my life, and it will continue changing lives long after we're all gone. Thank you for everything. With deepest gratitude, Sarah. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down on the table beside her chair and looked out the window at the mountains, at the bare trees waiting for spring, at the world that kept turning even as everything changed. She thought about Harold, about Eleanor, about Ruth and Dorothy and Helen and all the others who had passed through their lives over the years. She thought about Derek, still in prison, still a stranger. She thought about the vault beneath the mansion, its treasures long since converted to purposes far greater than gold. And she thought about Sarah, a young woman she had never met, shaped by the same forces that had shaped her, choosing the same path, carrying the torch forward into a future Margaret would never see. She picked up a pen and a piece of stationery. Her hands were unsteady now, her writing not as neat as it once was. But the words came easily, as they always had when they mattered. Dear Sarah, thank you for your letter. It means more to me than you can possibly know. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I remember her testimony at the trial, her courage, her dignity, her refusal to be defined by what had been done to her. I am honored that the Foundation could play some small role in her recovery. But the real hero of her story was Dorothy herself. And the real hero of your story is you. You watched suffering and chose to fight against it. You saw injustice and decided to dedicate your life to correcting it. That choice, that commitment, that is the treasure. I am an old woman now. Most of my friends are gone. My husband, the love of my life, waits for me somewhere beyond the mountains. But I am not sad. I am grateful. Grateful for the years we had, for the work we did, for the lives we touched. And now I am grateful for you. Go forward, Sarah. Help those who cannot help themselves. Protect those who have been betrayed. And remember, the treasure is not what we find. The treasure is what we give. With love and hope, Margaret Murphy. She sealed the letter and placed it in the outgoing mail basket. Then she sat back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened to the wind in the trees outside. Somewhere, a new spring was beginning. Somewhere, a young woman was preparing to continue the work. Somewhere, the story that had started with betrayal and loss was becoming a story about redemption and hope. And in a cottage at the edge of an Appalachian forest, an old woman smiled, knowing that some treasures are meant to be shared, and that the greatest gift is not what we receive, but what we pass on. Anyone can rebuild what has been broken if they have the courage to trust again, and the wisdom to know that true wealth is measured not in gold, but in the lives we touch and the hope we give. As the sun set over the Whitmore estate one final time, Margaret Murphy understood what her great-aunt Eleanor had known all along. The vault was never about protecting treasure. It was about waiting for someone worthy to find it, to use it, to transform it into something that would outlast gold and outlive stone. The wolves had come. The wolves had lost, and in their place, something beautiful had grown, a legacy of love, of service, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they refused to let betrayal have the final word. The story of Harold and Margaret Murphy wasn't about $265 million hidden beneath a decaying mansion. It was about two people who lost everything and found something better. It was about choosing hope over hatred, purpose over bitterness, and love over fear. It was, in the end, about what any of us might become if we're brave enough to open the doors that life places before us, even when we don't know what waits on the other side. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances. Click to keep journeying with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some treasures are meant to be shared.